you want a better angle of Phil? Are you happy?
This is pretty good. That's pretty good. Yeah.
You know what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Can't promise the audio quality will be great, but I'll try.
Can you
That's
take
fine.
some pictures?
Yes.
Okay.
Where's the book again?
You wouldn't even have thought to
Just me that
ask.
waves it. Cool. Cool.
Okay.
Welcome everybody to Treadwells, and it is a really happy occasion tonight that we are launching Queerying Occultures, which was your lockdown collection, which is a collection of Phil's articles that are from down the decades, with commentary and thoughts, and really some very important bits of history, and also some evolving thought. This to me, when I read this in the typescript, what struck me was it's an account of somebody who's been involved for a very long time, who is thinking all the time from day one and questioning themselves, questioning the world around them, questioning the culture around them, observing closely, and evolving as a person and evolving in thinking. And that is lovely to see, because that is the reality of being a person who's engaged in a world over a long period of time. We see snapshots and we respond to them, and then 4 years later we're seeing other things and responding to other things. It's real life, and often when we write, it seems like it's monolithic. This is the Phil Hine position on this. Well, what year, what month, after what experience? And we're also launching Acts of Magical Resistance, which is like I haven't read this since it's been in this form, so we're going to have some of that tonight. Phil, I'm going to take us to the 1980s.
Yep.
I'm going to take us to a place called Conway Hall, which was the place where all magic, which was a big hub of magical occulture in that decade. And
Everybody used it. I mean, fellowship. I mean, it was just like the place to have a conference.
Yep.
Yeah, Chaos people did it. The Fellowship of Isis had conferences there. Loads of people.
And in the 1980s, early to mid 1980s, the big thing then was ceremonial magic. There was the Servants of the Light. There was the Dolores Ashcroft-Nowitzki movement. It was ceremonial magic was what everybody knew and everybody did, and it was very group centered. So if you went along to the pub, which is everyone else went to the pub, within about 3 months of rocking up onto the occult scene, you were probably in some kind of a group, and that group was either one strand or other of ceremonial magic, or a reaction against it, but still using that structure. And tell us about the one conference.
The big thing about these ceremonial magic groups is that they have this concept of being contacted on the inner planes. And if you weren't contacted on the inner planes by some inner plane adept who was, of course, all wise and all knowing and all the rest of it, then you weren't a bona fide group.
Yeah, you were fake.
Anybody who's had any contact with these kind of groups will know what I mean. There's this whole phrase, well, they're not properly contacted, which became a badge of derision that was aimed at pretty much everybody who the person saying it disapproved of. So this particular conference.
What year were we at about?
87, 88, something like that. Maybe even 86. But everybody who was anybody in the ceremonial magic scene probably would have been there. People like Dolores Ashcroft-Nowitzki, what's his face, who's just died. Gareth Knight, yes. All the big names from the whole kind of like Servants of the Light, Servants of the Inner Light crowd. And this woman, whose name escapes me, stood up and was talking about the lodge she was running.
So she was a speaker.
She was a speaker, and she was also the head of a magical lodge. And she said, in kind of passing, well, theoretically, I could conceive of somebody of a homosexual temperament joining the lodge. At which point there was uproar. A whole section of the audience stormed out. And very shortly afterwards, a letter appeared in a Queerying Arrow,
which was the journal of the time, really.
Yeah, one of the most popular occult scenes at the time, signed by unknown persons claiming to be the head of a magical lodge, and basically saying nobody at that conference was properly contacted, because anybody who had any proper contact with the inner plane adepti would know that they would not, in any circumstances, countenance somebody of a homosexual temperament joining a magical lodge. This is not untypical of the time. If you weren't straight, you couldn't do magic.
What are some of the theoretical underpinnings of that?
A lot of it, I think, is to do with the idea of gender polarity, which works itself out in various ways. I mean, you know, the idea that you know, to be a proper man, you have to have a beard and probably wear a suit and have a decent bank balance and have a job. And to be a proper woman, you have to have long hair and wear flowing dresses, which obviously some people do, but you know, a very strict kind of like polarity between the sexes that doesn't allow for anybody who kind of like falls by the wayside.
If we can, we reel it back to Dion Fortune.
Oh yeah, Dion Fortune.
And the beginning of the 20th century, with the discovery of electricity, you have negative and positive, and the relationship between negative and positive currents makes electricity happen. And this was transposed onto heterosexual desire. So if you've got if there are two sexes, and there is electricity between them, there has to be desire between them, and they need to be distinct and different.
Yeah.
And it is binary.
You need a plug and a socket, and you can't have two plugs and two sockets, because obviously that would be, you know.
Yeah, but
that would be bad.
The development of electricity and how it moved into occult thinking as a structural analogy was just comes straight out of early 20th century science.
Well, I actually look at that in one of the essays in the history section of the book and trace it back to about the 18th century. But yeah, I mean, you know, this is one of the scientific props of the whole polarity discourse, that it has to be positive and negative, whether it's on the earth plane or the inner planes or whatever. And if you don't conform to that kind of like strict demarcation, then you're out of the picture. In my experience, this was pretty much right across the board. I encountered it in witchcraft, in ceremonial magic circles, amongst some tantric practitioners. You name it, you could find an argument anywhere. And one of the essays in the book is a selection of quotes from anything as diverse as Kenneth Grant to macrobiotics. One of my favourite Kenneth Grant quotes being, "Thus the blasphemy of the homosexual formula, for it denies Babylon and breeds devils in chaos."
Wow. Okay. So Kenneth Grant was huge in the 80s, like monstrously huge.
Still is.
And okay.
Well, there's lots of Kenneth Grant fan people around.
Yeah, and if we have and you know, famously, you know, started out in Leeds in the early chaos magic movement. You were there very early, and what were some? It was, you know, chaos magic was kicked against a lot of the dominant occulture of the time, which seemed quite elitist, sort of middle class, very suits and a bit suburban sometimes, and chaos was kicking against that. How did it encounter, you know, queerness, or, you know, the word didn't exist then, but, you know, gay people or bisexuality? Was it fighting that fight then, or not at all, or how did it cope?
It was a little bit more amorphous. I mean, I remember rocking up to Mallet Street in London, you know, London University, I think 1990, for the very first London Chaos Conference. This is before we moved to Conway Hall. And Pope Pete Carroll was there, and he was doing a demonstration of the Gnostic banishing ritual. And this is a thing where you have to intone various vowels in an ascending scale. So you start at the bottom with O, and then go up to E at the top. I think it's a long time since we did it. And Pete was like, oh, and when you get to the top vowel, you can pretend you're gay. And I just looked at him and shot back and said, yeah, and when you get to the bottom vowel again, you can pretend you're straight. And he kind of like gave me this little hairy eyeball. But then I was dressed resplendently in a pair of leather trousers, a silk kimono, and a feather boa. They may have confused him slightly.
When I came to London and hit the occult scene in January 1990. Phil was already famous in London, and I was a little blinky-eyed newcomer. And you were one of the very few out people in London at the time. And I was at that conference, and I remember your feather boa, and it was quite shocking, And so my question for you is, as somebody who was from 1990 at least, if not before, a feather boa wearer at these occult conferences. And quite outspoken, you and Gordon the Toad, Gordon McClellan, also, those are the only two people who I knew, and most people knew. And it was very much a scene then, which it wasn't now. What was it like for you? What was it like for him? What was the nature of the interaction? Because you were, and he were both very take no shit about who you were. You were not apologetic about who you were. You were not apologetic about being yourselves. And that was amazing. Actually, I'm just going to say that for the record. That was really astonishing.
It took me a while to work up to that point, I think. I mean, when I first started getting my head around my sexuality, if you like, and I'd come across people like a Wiccan high priestess in the Coven House saying, if you're gay or bisexual, you can't be a witch. And I'd read all this stuff in the occult books about, the various arguments about polarity or blocked chakras or reverse kundalini or whatever shit they'd come up with. And at first I was kind of like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing all this occult stuff. If all the authorities are saying I can't. And I just thought, no, fuck that. And I got angry. And I think that actually helped me quite a lot, because I started to just stand up and say, I'm here, deal with it. And I don't hear any shit about blocked chakras. And I think more importantly, I started to think, well, occultists have this tendency to deliver pronouncements, not as, this is my personal opinion, but this is like some platonic truth that's, descended off the astral plane and is still smoking with like ice or something, They're not giving you their opinion as a twat, they're telling you absolute occult truth, that we shall have no kinks in our circle, as one person put it to me. And I just thought, well, if that's the case with this shit we're coming out with, like Gareth Knight saying that homosexuality, like drugs, is a technique of black magic and it's perversion and it's evil. So like, not only is drugs bad, but queerness is bad. If they're wrong about that, then what else are they wrong about? And that I think took a while to sink in, but again that helped me and kind of like started to poke at a lot of occult theories and just saying, well, this is bollocks, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is somebody's opinion that's been enshrined, because nobody dare question it.
One of the things that you and I have talked about is the number of people for whom alternative sexual experiences or having sex with people of a non-straight type was happening often below the surface.
Yeah.
And there were people who would identify as gay if they were out, but they were absolutely not out. And I was just, what was that like for you to be in a world where that was going on? I came a little bit later and I wasn't really aware of that.
Well, let's say there's some people who are quite happy to have a same-sex experience as long as you didn't tell too many people about it. And of course, I was a bit of a blabbermouth with regards to some people, and in fact went to a big chaos magic conference and told everybody I'd slept with one of the people who ran the IoT section, which I think they were a bit discombobulated by, but everybody else was kind of like, ha ha ha, not one of my finest moments. But I think a lot of it was about self-presentation. So if you presented yourself to be, you know, confident and a bit strange, then people made room for you.
Right.
How that affected their actual opinions, I don't know. But the chaos magic scene was kind of weird because people, I'd say, were kind of up for things, but not necessarily wanted to make it part of their identity.
Right.
And also, chaos magic didn't really have anything much to say about gender, because I think a lot of the people then pushing the current were actually just not actually that interested, or in some cases were quite actively homophobic. I'm not mentioning any names, but
and a lot of chaos magic was not premised on polarity.
no, completely not.
So, you know, if you're making a sigil,
Doesn't matter.
it doesn't matter.
No.
Tell us about the double solar current.
Oh God, yeah.
I know the strings to pull to get the anecdotes.
This was after again some Conway Hall event, and I was in the pub around the corner, and this guy was going on to me about the double solar current. I was like, what the fuck are you on about? It was all couched in sort of Kenneth Grant speak, you know. And he goes, oh, the double solar current must be really powerful. What are you talking about? And eventually it dawned on me that he was basically talking about two men getting it off in a magical way. And I said something quite blunt about that. And he said, oh, it would have to be a magical act. Huh?
It would have
So,
to be a magical.
you know, this is the way some people can only frame their same-sex desires, is by making it a magical act, therefore moving it out of the space where ordinary same-sex occurrences happen, you know.
Right.
And I just can't, by, you know.
Right, so presumably a double lunar current would be two women.
A double lunar current would be two women. But this is how people talked about sex magic in I think in the 90s, as though their bums were stuffed with horsehair. You know, as if by, you know, talking about cups and wands and flaming swords and everything, it made it not quite sex in the normal way.
Right.
It was magical, of course, which, you know, elevates it to a higher position, which means you can ignore any little rumples on the way.
When did we start seeing the beginnings of what would become queer pagan camp, or a queer magic around London or around the UK? And how does it? I mean, we know. I mean, if anybody's on the internet, we know that in the States we got fairy tradition and queer radical fairies, so distinct queer traditions. And how did it? What's the story here?
Okay, well, first of all, I think the stateside experience is completely different to what happened in the UK. I mean, they had Leo Martello, an out gay witch who was writing, you know, prolifically in alternative newspapers in the 70s.
And was it Stonewall?
Sorry?
And was at Stonewall.
And was at Stonewall, yeah. And in this little book, I briefly mention the Los Angeles Gay Liberation Front in 1970 tried to levitate a 5-acre police precinct as a magical act against police brutality. And again, that's 1970, and as far as I know, there was nothing like that happening over here. Although there may have been some, you know, magicians involved in the British GLF. I don't know. That would be an interesting project. Over here, though, queer pagan camp started. I think the first camp was in 1999, and that was very much a reaction to the perceived heteronormativity of what we might call mainstream paganism. So 1999, it's 26 years ago, 24 years ago, but it doesn't seem like a long time. QPC was started by a very diverse bunch of people. There were some queer Wiccans who formed their own tradition. A lot of people who come from the queer eruption, kind of like radical queer politics happened and got interested in paganism. So, and it was a very diverse group, and basically what they did was they started this camp. It ran on, if you like, a DIY principle. Anyone could do workshops. They didn't make there were no sort of like personality leaders who got preferential treatment. If you wanted to do a workshop, you put your name on the blackboard, and if enough people were interested, you got a workshop. And there were some great workshops like Enlightenment Through Lipstick, or lots of gender bending workshops where there was one great ritual where everybody put on really bulky clothes so you couldn't tell who was who gender-wise. Lots of really good possession work. It was fantastic, and of course, as it became more popular, what happened was people out on the mainstream started saying, "Oh well, why don't you come to our gatherings and do this? Why did you split yourself off? You should have stayed, and we would have all enjoyed this." Fuck off. The good thing about QPC was it was a safe space. It ran on the basis of self-identification. If you said you were queer, that was fine. It didn't matter where your desires were oriented, if you indeed you had any. And people could do mostly what they wanted, without fear of being censored or having the nudge and winking going on, or hearing people going on about block chakras, which we'd all had quite enough of by then, thank you.
So QPC ran for 20 years? 18, 20 years, something like that?
Something like that, yeah.
So it was a 1 week camp once a year?
Yeah, 1 week to 10 days.
What do you think the impact was? I mean, so we got the impact of QPC, which you've got very, very accomplished and older, a whole range of ages, whole range of traditional backgrounds happening and being in a safe space, then going back into their communities. Everybody in the wider occult world knew about QPC, knew that it happened. It seemed that there was much more confidence coming out, to like a mainstream pagan event or a witch camp or this or that. I mean, to me, it seemed like the effect of QPC was subtle, but it meant that the people who've been at QPC were just, I don't know, like as people get more confident in their own skin, just easier in their own skin, having been in a safe space, the ripple out is going into another pagan camp where it's like, oh yeah, we're doing animal transpossession, and oh yeah, well, binary doesn't need to work that way, or like that's how it seemed to me.
I think it's complicated because another string in the bar, I would say, is the growing feminist goddess movement, which started to impact when Starhawk stuff come over here, late 80s.
Yeah, I would say 87 maybe.
Yeah, Greenham.
Yeah, of course, Greenham Common.
And I think the women's spirituality movement, which also butted up against that very traditional paganism in some quite severe ways. It wasn't an easy relationship by any sense, judging from my view on the periphery of it. I knew a lot of the women involved in the Matriarchy Reclamation and Renewal Network, for example. And they were challenging a lot of these very, strict gender mores as well. And I think, as I say, it's complicated, but I think since about the late 90s, I would say, there's been a much more growing openness, I think, from various different groupings about people being more aware of modern ideas about gender and polarity, if you like. And some people have accommodated to this idea of polarity, and some people have just gone, okay, we're not interested in that. And you get a situation now where some spokespeople for modern British pagan movement say, "Oh yes, we've always been queer friendly," which has not been my experience, or I think several of my colleagues. It's almost like they have a amnesia about, or it's just a few bad apples. There's no structural element to it, if you like. Despite the fact that in a lot of magical traditions, including Wicca, everything becomes gendered. The cup is the female, the dagger is the male, da 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 da.
And I think it's hard to see the tree of life in the Kabbalah without noticing the two pillars. which you can make more of or less of, which you can
There's
gender
a
or
book
not gender.
called Quaker Kabbalah now, which I've been listening to, which is kind of interesting. It makes me think, wow, if this had been around in the early 80s when I was studying Kabbalah, I might have stuck with it instead of forgetting it all.
Yeah, I mean, I think we say a lot about the relationship between force and form, mercy and severity, inner tension, without mapping it onto genitals or desire, or that that seems to people are moving more in that direction now, we're watching with interest, aren't we? If I'm going to redirect us. The title of your book is Queerying Occultures, and part of that is the queer part, and part is querying, and you're looking at some of the issues in paganism, you're looking at some of the issues around gender in paganism, and you've got some thoughts. And I'm going to just riff on that a bit.
I guess part of the impetus behind the book was to try and think critically about what happens when we bring the words queer and occulture together. They're almost like two separate concepts in collision. And spraying out in all directions. So I wanted to do some critical reflection on that process, not only from the point of view of using it, for example, queer theory to interrogate occult theory, but also to, if you like, critically look at some of the ways that queer paganism has been expressed. For example, one of the articles is about looking at Baphomet. Is it? I don't know. Better just check. Baphomet posing as a sodomite. Baphomet's presumably you're all familiar with the elitist Levi depiction of Baphomet as this pan-androgynous entity. In that essay, I'm kind of like critiquing that, saying there's a kind of machismo, Bapho-machismo, sometimes associated with invocations of Baphomet, like he's this chaos, queer deity. And I'm kind of speculating what would a pansy Baphomet look like, what would a soft Baphomet look like? Can we get away from this kind of like, if you're into chaos magic, you have to be all hard and transgressive. No, you don't have to be. So that's the kind of critical reflection I'm engaged in.
So it's got to be leather and spikes.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to wear leather, you must wear a feather boa as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Pink feather, hard leather and spikes. Yeah. Mercy and severity.
Or soft spikes, So
you do soft spikes. When you're coming up against things like what it is to be cool. I mean, this is me reading you. Okay. Is that when there are these ideas about what it is to be real, what it is to be hardcore, what it is to be a real magician, one of the strands that comes through for me is this subtext of the way in which we're brainwashed, in any subculture, in a macro culture, and those of us who are like, we're in a subculture, we're so counterculture, but if in that smaller world, this is cool, this isn't cool. This is what it is to achieve. This is it. These are the winners and these are the losers. And I would
call it brainwashing. These are just circulating cultural tropes.
Yes, I mean we are
unconsciously take on and harden.
Yeah, we are socialized apes, right? We survive by fitting into the little baboon group. So there's a certain amount of biological determinism in not wanting to be shunned. By the majority group, but one of these subconscious strands, or these ways of fitting in and ways of being inside and outside, is I'm really, really aware about the sense of in the sense of class. The ceremonial magic thing was quite upper middle class. Chaos was very reactive against that. Ideas about what it is to be, I remember turning up and everybody, the cool thing was to be anti-academic, right? That was absolutely, real magicians hate scholars. Like my big, deep, dark secret is I was enrolled at UCL for a PhD, right? I didn't tell anybody I even had a BA. I just didn't do it. I would have been absolutely booted out, and I didn't want to be booted out because I like hugging trees as much as the next pagan.
Yeah.
So I was aware of that one. But you know, you come from very, you know, your story is quite a different one.
Yeah, it's weird because there's the anti-intellectualist stuff, and I think that's still very much a strong trope for some people.
But so is the reverse of clinging. Anyway, but
Yeah,
I'll let you talk.
There's also this. I remember years ago here doing a lecture on some abstruse element of Tantra, and this person rocked up to me and said, "Well, of course, I work intuitively." No. Which is again one of these kind of like status builds. I don't have to read books. I don't have to, you know, study under a teacher. I just, you know, it all just falls into my lap from the gods, as it were.
I was initiated at age 9 by fairies.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to go there, but I have heard people saying that. And again, I think it's, you know, part of the self-reflexivity. That I think is so important to modern occultism is this ability to look at your own practices that you're engaged in and be critical of them, you know. Not just criticising other people, which of course we all often do, but it's equally important to, you know, critique our own practices, and this is one aspect of this querying idea is to bend things out of shape, if you like, in order to look at a different way of doing them.
I've run out of questions, Phil.
Okay.
So I would love to open up to you guys. And,
fair enough.
Yeah. So you've heard us natter. Please join in. And just give me a little wave of your hand of what you want to hear more about from Phil or want to ask about. Hi.
Thanks. I apologise if you've answered this in your book, but what I'm interested in is the transition. The transition to the kind of homophobic, gender essentialist world that you referred to. I mean, my principal area of interest, as you know, is the 19th century. And to be pagan and to be queer in the 19th century was pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
And you had Kenneth Graham, and you had Edwin Carpenter, even Oscar Wilde, and various other people. And then in the 20th century, you have Diane Fortune and so on coming along. And you know, there's the idea of gender polarity in her movement. What happens between those 2 points?
How did we go from queer Edwardians to homophobic Diane Fortune? You know, I think Bishop Ledbetter had a lot to do with that.
Oh, right.
The Ledbetter scandal. Because I spent, you know, I was going to put that stuff in there. I just thought, no, people find that far too boring. But prior to the Ledbetter scandal, which lasted for about 30 years.
Theosophist. For those of you who don't do 19th century, that's Theosophist, Theosophical movement.
You know, there's a lot of stuff in Theosophical discourse which is playing with ideas about gender in different ways. Along comes the Ledbetter scandal, which lasts for about 30 years, and after that, all that gets shut down. So I think the Ledbetter, and you know, one of the things that Diane Fortune continually bangs on about, I think, in psychic self-defense is theosophical lodges and, you know, using voice for black magical purposes. She's talking about Ledbetter, I think, also possibly Crowley, and some weird stuff that went on in Paris as well, which I touch on in the book. When I got involved in the occult in the late 70s, those ideas were pretty much dominant. And I think this is a reflection of how important Diane Fortune's work was to 20th century British occultism. You know, it was everywhere and it was quoted everywhere. And it is a really interesting phase to look through, and I think it deserves more research, how we went from a fairly queer accepting culture, also the wild trial itself.
Yeah.
Because I think there's something in one of the Theosophical journals about somebody being mildly critical of Madame Blavatsky because she was going to offer Theosophical membership to Wilde himself. I think that's definitely an area worth exploring. But yeah, it's also interesting thinking about occultism and politics, because again, my experience in the late 70s onwards was occultism and politics. If you're into politics and the occult, you're on the left-hand path. That's the unfortunate again. But again, if you look in the previous century, well, you know, Annie Besant, what's her name, death cursing Louis Pasteur, you know, they were all involved in politics. So I think there's a certain amount of cultural amnesia going on by the time we hit, if you like, the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, definitely.
I was thinking of any Americans in the house will know Walt Whitman, who was pagan in nature, if not by name, who was, you know, bisexual and very, very out with it, and a great of American literature, absolutely beloved of American literature as well. Other thoughts? Hi.
I don't really have like a specific question. This is me kind of just thinking out loud, but I feel as like a young woman kind of exploring spiritual spaces, there is this kind of quite insidious pipeline from sort of new age spirituality into some quite sort of alt-right opinions. I've noticed that a lot of the spaces I recently sort of left quite a toxic space that was very kind of binary in terms of menstruation as like a cis women's issue, and it just, I don't know, it really kind of put me off exploring spirituality, and I don't know if, like, I don't have a specific question, but I don't know if you could talk about
I mean,
that
you were talking about, like, you know, physical gender essentialism, you know, which we're touching on, like the great reclamation of second wave feminism was the reclamation of the body and the blood and the mess. And then, like, we get to the next generation, like, oh, well, not everybody does that. So how can we reclaim the body without being exclusionary? You know, but anything about gender, you know, about like bodies and gender essentialism or things on that?
Again, I think the two are related. As for, if you like, right-wing attitudes in spiritual spaces, they're there from quite early on, I would think.
Yeah.
There's a lot of left-wing stuff in spiritual spaces as well that doesn't get the attention. And I think it's people like Adorno who made a big essay about the occult in the, was it the late 40s, early 50s, where he basically said occultism is you know, right-wing jabber. And he made that kind of like hard distinction. But there's a lot of politics on both sides. Nowadays, it's much more apparent, because I think partly because we're much more aware of it, but it is unfortunate that lots of people who are into spiritualities of various sorts are completely right-wing lunatics. And, you know, there was a guy called Jack Smythe, did a book on witchcraft in the 60s, and he did an impromptu survey of British witches, and he said that a lot of them were really big fans of Enoch Powell.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
What's her name? Doreen Valiente, joining the National. Was it the National?
She did. Yeah, very briefly. She did leave. She did leave. She had her moment. Yeah. And there was, you know, the unfortunate teacher had her moment with the eugenicists. But, you know, that having been said, the Theosophists were absolutely massive overlap with the suffrage movement.
Yes.
And the anti-colonial movement.
Yeah, very much so. That's something I'm going to briefly in this.
Yeah, first animal rights, anti-vivisectionists, animal rights, vegetarian activists were occultists, particularly led by a woman named Annie Kingsford.
Anna Kingsford, yeah, she's the one who supposedly death cursed Louis Pasteur.
Yeah.
What she caught cold, apparently. And Annie Besant, who was the leader of the Theosophical movement for a good many years, was once known as Red Annie. And in fact, she organised the first match-skill strike, which was the first time that unskilled workers managed to actually win a major strike against their bosses.
Yeah, half the leadership of the Golden Dawn was were Fabian socialists.
Yeah.
So massive feminists for their time. Brought feminist plays. This this guy from somewhere in Scandinavia. He's writing these feminist plays. We must translate them. And the millionaire said, I'll sign the check. We'll put them on in the West End. And his name was Ibsen. Henrik Ibsen, I think, is his name. Right, we'll do that. And that's how Henrik Ibsen became famous, because these Golden Dawn feminist socialists, one of whom had a checkbook, said, we're going to do that. That's how. So yeah, it's on both sides. I grew up in a quite new age household, and I'm very, very aware. Those who are enlightened and those who are not. Is very much my upbringing. Basically, if you have a purple caftan and dangly earrings, you're trying to be enlightened. If you can do advanced yoga and you're white and male and you know how to eat quiche, you are there already. So that was a big binary of my new age childhood, from which I consider myself a lucky survivor. But yeah, you find it everywhere. Great point. Something else? Yeah, hiya.
Hi. I'd just like to share a little thing that I'd have no idea that this was going on today. And I'd like to share that it was absolutely wonderful that as a random queer transgender person wandering around London, I happened to come into Treadwells today, just saw a signed copy of your book upstairs and went and just asked about it and discovered that this was going on. I feel very privileged and happy. It's a wonderful coincidence. If such a thing exists, to have been here today to hear this and to be with you all.
Well, I hope you're enjoying it.
It's fantastic. I think it just goes to show that the vibe is strong.
Fantastic. I would like at this point to invite us all to continue the conversation in a more informal way. Upstairs over glasses of wine, and before I do that, I want to give a special thank you to my dear friends and colleagues, Rob and Hannah, who they greeted you, they served you wine. They're here as friends who help out. It looks quite posh, but we're held together by string, and bits of string, little bits of wax, and rubber and elastic bands, and the goodwill of enormous numbers of people. So I want to say a special thank you to them. And also, would you join me in thanking Phil? Thank you. Right, we can mill around. The air conditioning is only down here, but drinks are everywhere. Let's have some informal chats. And I'm gonna